Okay, hello guys. In this video, I will show you how we can filter out our output result from our API. But before that, I want to show you something. If you go to our Postman, when we send the data to the database, we have passed the raw password through the API and we save the raw password as it is in the database. This is not the best practice. So how should we store our data in the database? We need to do hashing or encryption to secure our data in our database. So how are we going to do that? I will create a function that will hash my password before I save it into the database. Okay, since this is a function that is not app specific, means that I can use this function in any project that I want. So I want to put it into the libraries folder. To create a library, I'm going to use the NestJS command, nestglib, and I'm going to name it as a utils library. So here we can see inside the libraries folder, we have created a utils library with these generated files. I don't want this module and service files. I want to create a new file which will contain all password related functions. So I'm going to name it as password.utils.ts. I am going to paste my code here. So just a little bit of explanation what I have done here. So I have imported the crypto modules from the Node.js package. So using this crypto module, I can properly hash my password. So these are my functions that you can copy and use it in your own project, or you can modify it according to your preference. So what are the main difference between hashing and encryption? So when you encrypt data, usually there will always be a way you can decrypt the data. So for password, we don't want encryption. Basically, we don't want somebody to decrypt the password and find out the original password. So what we do is actually we use a hash function to modify our input into a string that we will save it into the database. So how we can use this function in our project? I will open my users.service file. Here inside the create method, whatever input that we receive from the client, we will pass it into the database as it is. So I am going to comment out this line and return the input directly just for testing purpose. Okay. If we start our application, we test our application when we send a user like this. So these are our input exactly as we send it. So I don't want to pass this raw password. What I can do is I can modify the create user DTO password into something else. Let's say I am going to import the hash password function. Okay. I simply pass the password from our input and save it into the password field. Okay. Now if we test back our input, here we can see the password has been properly hashed and converted into a base64 string. So this is the value that I am going to save into the database, not this raw password. I can remove this return function and uncomment this line again. So the new data that I am passing to the database now contains the hashed password, not the raw password anymore. We can test our endpoint again and send it. Okay, we might have another user which is using the same email. So I'm going to change it into user2@user.com and send it. So we can see the data is saved correctly into the database. Okay, let us check our database. Here we can see before we implement the hash function, and the password is saved as raw password. And after hashing, we save this base64 string. So we can see our password is a little bit more secure now. So there's one more thing that I need to sort out. Here, when we created the user, we get this password back as a result, which is not the best way to do it. So we don't want the password field to be reflected in any of our endpoints. So how we are going to filter out this field from being sent back to the user? There are a couple of methods how we can do this, and I am going to show them one by one. So when we use this create method, we will receive an object and we return this user object to the client. So another way to look at it is like this. So we have received a user object from this method and we directly return the object. So the user here represent the whole row of the object that we have created. So every time we create a new object, it will return the whole row, including the password. So how to remove the password field? There are a couple of ways. First, we can use the built-in function delete to delete any field from any object. Let's say we want to delete the user password. So here we have an error since the user is actually a promise of user. So we need to change it into a synchronous function and await the result. So now we can delete the user. We can test our API again, user3@user3.com, and send it. So now we can see the password field has been removed. So another way to filter out the password field from being sent to the client is by using assignment. Instead of saving the whole user object inside a user variable, I can assign it like this. So here I am destructuring the object into two parts. So for the password value, I save it into password variable, and the rest of the value, I save it into the user object. This is best if you want to separate your object into multiple objects or multiple variables. Let's say I want to use the password field again. And console log user object. So I don't need this delete function. Save. And we test back our endpoint. So user4 send. Here we get the same result. So another way we can filter out unwanted information inside our result is by using serialization. What does it mean? So basically we transfer the values inside our object into another object. For example, so I'm going to revert back this user. So I'm going to save the object into a user variable. Okay. And I'm going to create a new object. So this new object has some properties such as name, which I'm going to get the value from the user.name, perhaps ID from the user.id. So I am assigning the values from here inside this new property here. Let's say email, user.email, roles, I think. Okay. Okay, now instead of returning the user object, I want to return this new object. So here we can see we don't have the password fields here. It seems quite tedious here since we need to assign the values one by one. However, the advantage here is we can filter out our input, or we can rename our object. Let's say instead of using name, I can change it into this full name. And I don't want the roles to be shown into the data. I can do it like that. So right now I have a completely different object and I'm going to test it. So here we can see our return value is according to our object value now. So we can further improve our implementation by creating a new user entity. So this user is going to be different from the user created by the Prisma client. This user is going to implement the user of the Prisma user. However, here we can see the user here refers to itself, which is not what is intended. So I need to import the proper user type from Prisma. So import user from Prisma client. We can see that we have some error here since we are importing a user type and it clashes with our class here. I am going to rename it as Prisma user to differentiate between the user object. Let's say now I want to implement this Prisma user. We can see we can implement it now. By implementing the Prisma user, we have all the same properties inside the Prisma user class. However, we want to make sure that the password is optional here. And we will have an error since the password inside the Prisma user is required. So we are going to do the same thing by declaring partial Prisma user. So now we don't have the error anymore. Okay, now I can use this entity instead of this partial user here. I can straight away use user. However, this user is not from Prisma client anymore. I want to import this user from our entity instead. So now this new user object has the password field as optional. Okay, we can test our API again and it will give the same result. We can further improve our implementation here. Instead of assigning this value one by one, we can use the constructor function. So we can modify our user class to have a constructor function. And this constructor function is going to have user as an input, and this user input is going to be a type of partial user. And we want to assign the value into this object. Okay, so object.assign is a method that we can use to populate these values inside this user object into any of the properties inside this user class. So instead of using this, I can create a new user object, and this user object has one argument, user. So we can test it now. Send. However, we can see the password field is still populated because inside our user object, the password field, even though it is optional, we still have the values from the user here. So if the user has the password value, it will also be assigned to this password field inside this user object. We can fix it by using Exclude Decorator. So this Exclude Decorator comes from the class transformer package. So this Exclude Decorator will mark a given class or property as excluded. So we mark this password field as excluded, and it will be applied during transformation. So where do we transform it actually? So usually we will transform our data in the input or output side of our API endpoint. Let's say inside our controller, here our input is by using create user DTO, and also when we return this object. So we want to apply this transformation here. So to apply this transformation here, we can use this decorator, use interceptors, and we want to use this class serializer interceptor. So this interceptor is a built-in NestJS interceptor that will properly serialize and transform our object. So we can test out our implementation. Here, I'm going to print out the data, which is built using the constructor. And by returning the value, I can see the output from the postmain result. So we can test it by creating another user, send. Here we can see the password field is not included inside the output. We can do some code cleanups here. Instead of declaring some variables, user and new object, I can simply return this value, new user, and the input is object. And I don't need this one. Okay, now our create method is ready. So we will move on to other methods. For this find all method, when we call out this find many methods, we have here some extra arguments which we can use to actually filter out our data. Okay, Let's go to our Postman and execute this find all method. Send. Here we can see all the users in our database, and we can see the password field is shown here. So how we can improve our result here? We can use this select field to select the columns that we are going to display. Say for example, we use select, and we can use this select argument like we use in SQL query, select all or select some columns from table. So we can define like this. Let's say we want the ID field, we set it as true. We also want the name field, we set it as true, and we can check what is the output. Here we can see we got the ID and name. So we are going to implement the rest of the fields that we think we need. Roles, email, and password. Okay, here if we don't want this field password, we can simply remove it from our select arguments. Okay, we can see we have our object ready. Okay, how about this find one method? So we can implement it using this Prisma service dot user find, actually find unique, or find, it should be find unique, and it accept where argument, where id is equal to id. Okay, we pass the id into the query, and it will match out the column which has the id. So let's say we have a user 42, send. Here we got the user 42. Again, we want to filter out this password, so we can reuse our object here, this user, or we can still use the select argument to filter out the data. Okay, I'm going to copy this value. Okay, now we can see the password is gone now. Okay, how about this update? So return this Prisma service dot user dot update method. So this update method accepts where arguments and also the data. Okay, where should be id equal to id, and the data is our update user DTO object. Okay, so the update user DTO is simply extending the create user DTO object. So we can still use these values to update our user. Okay, let's say I want to change the user. I can go to the controller. Let's say we need to pass the parameter and also the object body. Okay, we can pass the params. ID is 42. And in the body, I want to change the name. Let's say new name. Send it. And we can get the new updated object. However, we can see the password field is still being shown here. So let's fix that. We can use the select method also to filter out the data. Here we can see the password no longer shown. How about this remove method? We can do it like this, returning this dot prisma service dot user dot delete, and my argument is where id equal to id. All right, let us test it. Here we can see there's an error because the user is not there, and we can test it with a proper value. Let's say user 45. We want to delete it. So users, I want to name is id 42. Send. Here we can see we have deleted the object. I can implement the filter also. Let's say I'm going to use select only the ID. I don't need anything else lah. Okay, so by using the select method, I can filter out the data at the query level. So we have here two options. Either we modify our output using a class transformer, or we filter it out at the database level. So for this create method, I want to improve it also. If we don't really need the data, we can simply filter out the data at the database level itself. So it will be more efficient for us. Here I can use select to for this. However, we can see that we have repeated this field quite a couple of times. So to make it a little bit cleaner, so I'm going to create a default variable. Let's say okay, spot variable user default, user select default value, and it's going to be a type of prisma dot user select, and I'm going to assign the value here. Okay, we can see the value is id email name. Id I'm going to set is true. To make my job easier, I'm going to copy and paste this one. Here I've created a default value for the select arguments. I can use it like this. Instead of passing the select, I can pass it select user user select default value, and I will update the rest with this value also. Okay, let's check it again. Here we can get it exactly as we want. So there's no value for 42. We have 45. All right. So that's it for this video. So until now, we have managed to create a proper endpoint for the users. We also implement how we can actually filter or improve or validate our input and also our output. So in the next couple of videos, I will focus more towards securing our API using proper authentication. See you in the next video.